Even an old trash sweeper thinks he gets to have a code name, Mason Hale sneered, then flung a tray of hot food straight onto the old janitor in the Marine Corps mess hall. Laughter exploded. The smell of sauce rose. Humiliation, violence, power laid bare. The entire base knew who Hale was. A protected drill sergeant. Fast results. If he wanted to crush someone, he crushed them. And standing in front of him then was only an invisible old man, head bowed for 8 straight years. But only a few seconds later, just a single moment, the old man lifted his head. "Rooster is my son's name." The laughter froze. Then he continued, his voice cold as a knife. The exact kick, the exact angle of attack, the exact moment camera number 4 went dark at 1017 p.m. The entire mess hall fell silent. No one could understand why a janitor knew things only the perpetrator should know. He was not a man begging for pity. He was a father who stayed on base for 8 years, waiting for the day the truth would open its own mouth. If you were Harlan Vance, would you stay silent to survive, or stand up to face the man who killed your child, and the entire system shielding him? Comment your choice below. And if this story makes you angry, hit subscribe, because what happens next is far more brutal. Mornings on the U.S. Marine Corps base always began the same way, so predictable that one could almost guess its every breath. The whistle sounded when the sky was still caught between night and day. Hallway lights snapped on, rows of gray buildings emerging under a flat glow that favored no one. Harlan Vance appeared at that moment, pushing his familiar mop cart out of the supply room. The wheels rolled slowly over the cold concrete, making a small, steady sound, enough to exist, but not enough for anyone to turn their head. He walked down the barracks hallway, where steel doors lined up in perfect order. Young Marines stepped out of their rooms, tightening laces, pulling at collars, finishing half-spoken conversations about the upcoming drill. They passed by Harlan with the instinct of people accustomed to everything around them serving their needs. A sleeve brushed his arm, and a pair of boots nearly clipped the mop head. No one stopped, and no one apologized. To them, Harlan was like a wall or a light post in the hallway, always there, and not expected to react. Harlan bent down to wipe a still wet stain, pulling the mop slowly and steadily. He worked carefully, each movement with just enough force, and just enough time. Behind him, a sergeant's voice rang out, dry and short. "Hurry up, don't leave this place dirty." Harlan straightened, gave a single nod, his eyes glancing past the speaker before returning to the floor. He kept pushing the cart, his pace unchanged. Commands like that had become background noise in his life, familiar enough that they no longer had the power to irritate him. In the left chest pocket of Harlan's shirt was a small, heavy object. Every time he bent or turned, it tapped lightly against his rib, creating the faintest pressure. Harlan knew exactly where it sat, as if his body had learned to remember the spot. He had never taken it out in front of anyone on the base, not out of fear, but because he understood there were things that, once revealed, would shatter the invisible shell he had built over many years. The base operated under clear principles. Rank determined value. Reports determined existence. Anything not written down was treated as if it had never happened. Harlan understood this early on. He was a contracted janitor, with no rank, no permanent status, and not appearing in any chain of command. He showed up, worked, got paid, and disappeared from everyone's sight once his shift ended. To this system, he was a space convenient enough to ignore. By midday, the mess hall became the only place on the base that could be called loud. Metal trays clattered, chairs scraped across the floor, and the smell of hot food mixed with sweat and military fabric. Harlan pushed his cart in and began wiping up spilled water and scattered crumbs. The job usually went quickly, but that day, as on many others, he lingered longer near the officers' tables. His eyes moved over each face, each gesture, each posture, not rushed, not openly suspicious, just a slow, careful look, like someone rereading a familiar page but wanting to remember every detail. A private at a nearby table leaned toward his friend, whispering, "That old man's probably been here forever." The other chuckled, answering, "Yeah, I see him every day." Harlan heard them, but he didn't react. Remarks like that passed through his ears daily, falling into a space inside him already cleared for them. He bent down to wipe under the table once more, then pushed his cart on, leaving behind scattered laughter. The afternoon slipped by slowly. The drill field gradually emptied, with only a few recruits staying behind for extra practice at their instructor's request. Harlan cleaned the outdoor area, gathering empty bottles, pulling mobile barriers back into place. Sea wind blew in with a salty chill that crept under his collar. He pulled his cap lower and kept working until the lights on the tall poles flicked on. When his shift ended, Harlan pushed his cart back to the storage room, hung the mop on its hook, and washed his hands under cold water. He watched the water run between his fingers for a long moment before turning it off. On his way out the side gate, he passed a young Marine on duty. The Marine glanced at him and gave a perfunctory nod. "Done for the day," Harlan replied. "Yeah," his voice even and low. The exchange ended there, clean and simple like everything else in the day. Harlan's rented room sat along the base fence, in a row of low buildings reserved for janitors and contract workers. The small room held just enough space for a single bed, an old wooden table, and a chair. He turned on the light, the yellow glow, revealing chipped paint on the walls. Harlan sat down, removed his cap, and placed it on the table. In that rare moment, the weariness on his face appeared clearly, slow and deep, like something built up over many years. He reached into his chest of pocket and took out the object that had stayed with him all day. A silver Zippo lighter lay in his palm. Its surface was covered in fine scratches, marks of time, and too many years of handling. The word "Rooster," etched into the lighter's lid, remained sharp, each letter carved deep into the metal. Harlan looked at it, his gaze steady for a long time, long enough that the room around him seemed to fade. He flipped the lid open. The metal clicked softly, familiar. A flame rose, small and trembling, reflected in his eyes. Harlan held it there for a few seconds, unmoving and silent. The light touched the lines at the corners of his eyes, making them stand out more clearly. Then he snapped the lid shut. The flame died instantly, leaving a brief pocket of darkness before the room light filled it again. Harlan set the Zippo on the table, his fingertips still resting on the cool metal lid. Outside, a military vehicle rumbled past, distant and steady, like the base's heartbeat that never stopped. He leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, looking straight ahead. The resignation he wore during the day was gone, replaced by a quiet focus, like someone waiting for a moment planned long ago. The voice of the story slowed, each word falling like a key sliding into a lock. Rooster was not his code name. It was the name that kept him from leaving this base. 8 years earlier, Harlan Vance still lived in a small town not far from the base. His life then was simple enough to be measured by the habits he repeated each day. Waking up early, making coffee, and opening the garage to check his old pickup truck. His son had been in the military for a few months, the calls growing less frequent, shorter, usually ending with the familiar line, "I'm fine, don't worry." Harlan heard his son's voice through the phone and recognized the exhaustion hidden behind the neat answers, but he understood the military was like that. He had served before. He knew silence was sometimes considered part of discipline. The call came on a late afternoon, when sunlight had already started slipping down the roof. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. Harlan picked up, and the voice on the other end was even and brief, stating his name, confirming a few pieces of personal information, then informing him that his son had died during training, the recorded cause being sudden heart failure. The sentence was spoken like a line in a report. There was no pause for him to ask anything, no explanation attached. The call ended before Harlan could finish a single question. He stood still for a few seconds, the phone still pressed to his ear. In his mind, each word he had just heard repeated itself mechanically, refusing to come together with meaning. Heart failure, training, sudden death. Those words did not match the image of the son he knew, a healthy young man who could run miles every morning and still laugh. Harlan set the phone down on the table and looked at it as if the device had betrayed him. He took a deep breath, pulled out a chair, only to stand again. The small room suddenly felt tighter than usual. The trip to the base happened in silence. Harlan drove the long road almost without remembering which stretches he had passed. When he arrived, an officer received him directly and guided him through a few hallways, familiar to anyone who had served. The officer's voice held just enough distance, polite but cold. He spoke of procedures, of paperwork to sign, of the timeline for releasing the body. Harlan listened, nodded, and answered the necessary questions. Inside him, another part quietly recorded every small detail, from the way people avoided looking him in the eye to the slightly slower pace of their steps as they walked past him. The morgue door opened, cold air spilled out, tightening the skin on Harlan's face for a moment. He stepped inside alone. No one followed, and no one waited in the room. His son lay there on the metal table, covered by a thin sheet. Harlan stood still for a few seconds before reaching to pull the sheet down. He didn't rush. He needed to see clearly. His son's face was pale, different from the familiar tone he knew, On the neck and shoulders were scratches already starting to darken. Bruises spread unevenly along the ribs, as if struck multiple times from different angles. Harlan studied each mark, slow and precise. He didn't flinch or step back. He had seen injuries on the battlefield, had bandaged comrades, and had witnessed deaths given many different names. The marks before him did not belong to heart failure. His eyes stopped at his son's chest, a clear imprint of a boot tread, so recognizable he knew it immediately. Harlan reached out and touched it lightly, his fingertips resting on the hardened mark. His hand was steady, not trembling. The coldness of the skin traveled up his arm, bringing with it a frightening clarity. In that moment, all doubt vanished. He knew exactly what he was looking at. An officer stood in the doorway, reminding him that time was limited. The tone remained calm, as if this were a daily task. Harlan turned, looked at the man, and asked a simple question. This was a training accident. The officer nodded, answering quickly. The paperwork is complete. Everything followed procedure. The way he said it made it clear that the answer had been used many times before. Harlan stayed silent for a few seconds, then asked, "Where's the surveillance camera footage from that area?" The officer avoided his eyes, glancing to the side before replying. The system malfunctioned at that time. The line flowed smoothly, without hesitation, as if prepared in advance. Harlan looked into the man's eyes, searching for any sign of doubt or unease, but saw only the caution of someone fully aware of what he represented. On the table outside the morgue, a stack of papers had already been placed. The death certificate lay on top, the cause of death printed neatly, clearly, not a word extra. Harlan picked up the pen and read it one more time. He signed his name where required, the strokes straight and even. No one hurried him, and no one stopped him. The moment passed faster than he expected, as if the system was accustomed to ending everything with a few lines of ink. When all procedures were done, Harlan was escorted outside. The hallway lights were still bright. People still moved through it. Orders and bootsteps still echoed with their familiar rhythm. Life inside the base carried on, completely separate from what had just happened in the cold room behind him. Harlan walked among them, carrying a weight no one around him could see. He stopped at the end of the hallway and turned back toward the morgue door now closed. In his mind, the images he had just seen stacked over one another, sharp and clear. He understood that from this moment on, everything would change. The truth he knew had no place in those tidy reports. If he reacted right away, if he shouted or demanded an investigation, his son's story would be buried faster, cleaner, more thoroughly. Harlan stepped out of the building and drew a deep breath. The air outside was cold and salty, filling his lungs like a reminder that the world was still moving as usual. He stood there for a moment, his hands in his pockets, eyes drifting toward the drill field where the lights were turning on. The images in his mind settled, making room for a slow but solid decision forming. As he left the area, Harlan murmured to himself, his voice low and steady, just loud enough for him to hear. If he couldn't seek justice from the outside, he would stay inside. After the funeral, Harlan Vance returned to the base with a decision that surprised many. He applied to work as a contracted janitor, signing a simple sheet with a barely livable wage and rigid terms. The personnel officer looked at him a few seconds longer than usual, asking why a former service member chose this job. Harlan answered plainly, "I'm used to this environment." The answer didn't invite further questions. On this basis, people were accustomed to accepting responses that were just enough. The first days passed slowly. Harlan's work repeated by the hour, by the day, mopping hallways, cleaning the mess hall, sweeping the drill field. He relearned the rhythm of the base like studying an old language. Everything laid out with clear order, each time slot tied to a task, each whistle tied to an action. Outwardly, he looked like any other janitor, head down, working, taking orders, leaving when the shift ended. Inside, he began to observe. The drill field was where he lingered the longest. It was where his son had once run laps under the sun, once fallen and stood back up, once laughed while talking about exhausting training days. Harlan cleaned each corner of the field, pulling the mop across old stains that were pressed deep into the concrete. Some dark streaks never disappeared despite his scrubbing. He knew they were marks of time and sweat, maybe something else. He didn't try to erase them entirely, he only memorized where they were. During the day, the drill field followed the official schedule, everything happening in plain view. At night, Harlan noticed a different rhythm. Lights turned on late, and small groups of Marines appeared whose names were not on the daytime roster. These training sessions were fast and harsh. Shouts, footsteps, sometimes a muffled groan swallowed between commands. Harlan stood at the edge of the field, broom in hand, eyes lowered, ears open. He remembered the official schedule posted in the office. These sessions weren't on it. The camera in the corner of the field was the next thing that drew his attention. In daytime, its indicator light was always on, its angle covering the whole area. At night, at certain times, that light went dark. Not always, but often enough to form a pattern. Every time the shouting grew unusually sharp, Harlan glanced at the camera pole. Many times, it was still dead. A few minutes later, the light returned as if nothing had happened. He didn't write anything down or mark anything. He kept the times in his memory, piecing them together. Young Marines began recognizing him. They called him by generic names: old man, janitor guy. Someone asked how long he had worked there. Harlan answered, a while. The vague reply ended the conversation. He heard them complain about soreness, about injuries after training sessions. Those complaints usually stopped the moment an officer walked by. Voices lowered, expressions changed, bodies straightened. Harlan noticed how quickly that switch happened, like a reflex trained into them. In the whispered conversations between Marines, one name started appearing more often: Mason Hale. At first, just offhand mentions, voices mixing fear and respect. People said he produced fast results, said that, under him, the weak were weeded out early. Some laughed while saying it, and some went silent right after. Harlan listened, noted it, and didn't ask more. He knew names repeated in a place like this were rarely random. Harlan began paying attention to Mason Hale from a distance. He had never stood face to face with him, never spoken to him. He watched how Hale walked across the field, how he gave orders, how those around him reacted when he appeared. Hale had a presence that altered the space around him. Others' voices softened, movements slowed. Harlan stood at the edge, working with his hands, watching with his eyes, like someone re-watching a familiar scene. But knowing this time, he had to remember every detail. One rainy afternoon, the drill field was muddier than usual. Harlan was gathering trash at a corner when Hale walked by. He kicked a metal bin hard, the container rattling as its lid popped off with a clatter. Hale said, "Move," his tone irritated, his eyes sliding past Harlan like past an obstacle. Harlan stepped back half a pace, head lowered, broom handle held tight. He didn't look at Hale as he walked away, but in his mind, that image was placed exactly where it belonged. Time passed like that, day after day, month after month. Harlan gradually became used to living in two layers: the surface layer, where he was an invisible janitor, and the inner layer, where he observed and connected pieces. Some nights, he returned to his room and sat for a long time in front of his silver Zippo, opening and closing it, as if reminding himself of the reason he was still there. Some days, anger rose so sharply he had to stop his hands for a moment just to steady his breathing. He wondered whether he was waiting for something too vague. 8 years was long enough for people to forget many things, long enough for a system to reinforce all its shields. There were moments when he looked at the empty drill field after training and questioned whether he had been wasting his time in all this silence. The question rose and faded, replaced by another thought, firmer. He knew that if he left, everything he had seen would become meaningless. One evening, when Harlan was cleaning the mess hall later than usual, he heard two young Marines talking quietly. They mentioned a recruit injured during the previous night's training. One said, he couldn't handle it. The other answered, that's how it is in Hale's group. They fell silent when an officer entered. Harlan bent down to wipe the floor, his hands slowing. In his mind, another piece slipped into place. 8 years passed, each small detail accumulating, enough to form a picture only Harlan could fully see. He understood clearly that his son had not been the only one. Mason Hale didn't need to be introduced in the usual way. On this basis, the name already carried its own weight. People spoke of Hale in lower voices, even when their comments were casual. He was the drill sergeant with outstanding performance, someone superiors mentioned in meetings with satisfied expressions. Beneath Hale's file were impressive numbers: high training completion rates, shortened timelines, and fewer recruits washed out than average. To the system, that was success. To those under him, it was a different story. Harlan saw Hale for the first time from a distance. On the drill field one morning, Hale stood straight, broad-shouldered, his voice loud and clear. He barked at the recruits in the center of the field, needing no microphone. If you want to quit, take off your uniform. The sentence hit the concrete and echoed in a brief silence before the young Marines resumed running. No one stopped. No one reacted. Harlan stood at the edge of the field, mop in hand, eyes following each movement. He recognized the type immediately: those who believed pressure was the only way to produce results. In another training session, a recruit fell while sprinting, his body pitched forward, hands hitting the ground, breaths breaking into fragments. Hale didn't signal a stop. He checked his watch, then ordered them to continue. A nearby sergeant hesitated for a moment before repeating the command. The group kept running, leaving the fallen recruit behind for a few seconds before he struggled to his feet and rejoined. Harlan watched without blinking. He had seen similar moments many years ago, in other places, under other names. After the session, a superior officer walked with Hale along the field. They exchanged brief remarks. The officer nodded as Hale reported the results. His tone held approval, noting that training progress had improved. Hale replied with a thin smile, the kind used by someone who knew he was protected. Harlan stood a few meters away, pretending to tidy up, his ears catching every word, every pause. He understood clearly that in this system, results always came before people. Hale passed by Harlan many times in the days that followed. Sometimes he was close enough that Harlan could smell sweat and dust on his uniform. Hale didn't look at him, his gaze sliding past like over a post or a supply bin. The disregard wasn't personal, it was habitual. For Hale, people like Harlan did not fall within the range of what required awareness. Harlan recognized that, and remembered it, because invisibility could sometimes be a useful position. One rainy afternoon, the drill field was wet and slick. Harlan had cleaned since morning, but mud kept being dragged out by cleated boots. Hale appeared, looked at the ground, then called Harlan over. He pointed to a spot on the concrete, saying it was dirty. Harlan took the broom and began cleaning again, even as the rain kept falling. Water mixed with mud into long streaks. Hale watched for a few seconds, then walked away, leaving Harlan alone on the field. Young Marines looked at the scene, then turned back to their tasks. No one intervened, no one objected. Harlan bent down, wiping each streak, feeling the rain seep through his shirt, cold against his back. During rare breaks, Harlan heard the young Marines talk. They mentioned Hale with half-joking, half-serious tones. He's rough, but you come out different after training with him, someone said. In his group, the weak get cut early. Their voices held both fear and admiration. Harlan recognized how dangerous that acceptance was. When violence was labeled as effective, it became part of discipline, something protected by the very results it produced. Harlan began watching Hale more closely. He observed how Hale controlled space, how he paused just long enough to draw every gaze toward him, how he spoke to superiors differently than he spoke to recruits. Hale understood his position in the chain of command and used it to its fullest. Harlan stood at the edge, close enough to see, far enough to avoid notice. Sometimes, Harlan asked himself why someone like Hale was shielded so easily. The answer grew clearer with time. Hale didn't act alone. Around him were people willing to repeat his orders, willing to look away when necessary, willing to write reports most conveniently. The system didn't create Hale, but it kept him in place because he served exactly what it wanted. One evening, Harlan stood in the mess hall late and heard two officers talking. They discussed adjusting training methods to meet higher expectations. One said Hale might be controversial, but his results were hard to deny. The other laughed, saying that in this environment, results were the only thing anyone asked about. Harlan mopped nearby, each word falling into his ears, heavy and clear. Hale's presence gradually became a distinct outline in the picture Harlan was piecing together. The night sessions, the cameras that turned off at the right moments, the injured recruits, all of it had Hale somewhere nearby. He wasn't always the one giving the direct order, but his name always surfaced at the end of every story. Harlan had never confronted Hale, never asked him a question. He understood that confronting Hale directly would lead to only one outcome: permanent silence. One afternoon, when the sunlight had softened, Harlan stood in the hallway looking out at the drill field. Hale was talking with a group of officers. He smiled, nodded, and gestured toward the field as if explaining something. Harlan watched him for a long time. For the first time, his gaze shifted, no longer just cold observation, but a deeper assessment, like someone measuring the distance before taking a long step. Harlan understood that Hale could not fall from the outside. The layers of protection around him were too thick, too accustomed to shielding him. Everything would be wrapped again in reports, in procedures, in prepared answers. If the truth was ever going to surface, it had to come from somewhere else, from someone close enough to Hale to see clearly, low enough to be expendable, and long enough inside the system to understand how it worked. The narrative voice lowered, slow and steady, as if adding another lock to the story. To bring Mason Hale down, someone had to be close enough to him. Harlan Vance began paying attention to Cole during one of the night training sessions that lasted longer than usual. When the floodlights switched on, the drill field appeared in uneven patches of light and shadow, and at the edge of the field, near the surveillance camera pole, Cole was always there, not in the center, not in a place where names were easily called. Close enough to see every movement on the field, far enough to avoid notice. Harlan recognized this wasn't accidental. On the basis, a person's position always said, a great deal is said about their role. Cole wasn't remarkable. He didn't yell, didn't act aggressively, and didn't try to win favor with superiors. He did his part, repeated orders when necessary, recorded times, and reported what was required. On paper, Cole was a stable sergeant, someone who didn't cause trouble, but the longer Harlan observed him, the clearer he saw a slight disruption in Cole's rhythm, something not shown through big actions, but through brief pauses, glances that shifted at the exact moment they shouldn't. During one night session, as the recruits ran their final sprint, one of them collapsed. A short, sharp cry escaped, cutting into the heavy breaths around it. Cole stood nearby, one hand on his radio. Instead of looking down at the field, he turned his head toward Mason Hale. That look lasted less than a second, but Harlan saw it clearly. It was the look of someone waiting, not a decision-maker, but someone seeking direction so he wouldn't have to carry responsibility alone. Hale barked an order to continue. His voice rang out firm, leaving no space to question. Cole lifted his radio and repeated the command. His voice was lower, less steady than in earlier sessions. The group kept running. The one who had fallen struggled to stand, staggered a few steps, then merged back into formation. Harlan stood at the edge of the field, broom in hand, eyes on the concrete, ears following every shift in Cole's tone. There were moments when the camera in the corner shut off. The indicator light flicked from green to dark for a moment. Each time, Harlan glanced up out of habit. Cole knew it, too. Harlan saw him turn away, his eyes avoiding both the field and the camera pole. He stayed still, as if that brief darkness had nothing to do with him. He didn't step out, didn't intervene, didn't walk away. His silence during those moments was different from everyone else's. It carried attention, as if he were holding himself back from a choice he wasn't ready to make. After each night session, when most people had left the field, Cole often stayed longer. His hand remained on his radio, even though training was over. Once, he stared down at the empty ground, where only dried sweat stains and faint boot marks remained. Harlan was cleaning nearby, dragging the mop over familiar patches. He lifted his head for a moment and caught Cole standing still like that. Harlan's gaze lingered a second longer, not out of curiosity, but because he recognized that posture. He had stood exactly like that years ago. In uniform, caught between two opposing orders, Cole began showing subtle changes that only a careful observer would notice. He spoke less during the short pre-training meetings. When Hale issued directives, Cole nodded a bit slower. Once, a younger sergeant chimed in, joking with Hale, offering a showy suggestion. Hale laughed, clapped him on the shoulder, then assigned that sergeant to oversee a few training sessions in Cole's place. The shift happened quietly, no announcement, no explanation. Cole stood there, accepted the new assignment, and nodded as usual. But from where Harlan stood, he saw Cole's jaw tighten for a moment. In the following sessions, Cole stood farther from the camera. His old position was gradually taken over by the younger sergeant, who seemed excited, repeating Hale's commands with energetic confidence. Cole was assigned to secondary tasks, checking rosters, logging times, and duties with little influence. The change wasn't big enough to be called a reprimand, but clear enough to send a message. Harlan watched how Cole reacted. He didn't complain, didn't resist, didn't try to reclaim his place. He carried out his new duties carefully, keeping his record clean. But on some nights, when the field was empty, Harlan saw Cole standing alone by the fence, looking inward as if trying to see through the dark. In those moments, his eyes no longer held the mechanical focus of someone on duty, but a slow, tired strain. In a rare moment, while Harlan was putting tools away near the storage shed, Cole walked by. They didn't speak, but Cole nodded, a small gesture he had never made before. Harlan nodded back. The moment passed quickly, but for Harlan, it meant something. He knew people who began recognizing each other in silence had already crossed a line in their thoughts. Cole wasn't cruel. Harlan saw it in the way he avoided looking directly at collapsed recruits, in how his voice softened when repeating an order. But Cole also wasn't ready to stand against the system. He still followed procedure, still kept everything running smoothly. His conflict came from seeing too much without knowing where to place what he had seen. At night, Cole often sat long time in front of his phone. Harlan didn't know this, but he could guess. He had been in that place himself, where a person weighed the choice between living safely and confronting what they couldn't forget. Cole still had family, still had career prospects, still had enough reasons to convince himself that staying silent a little longer was reasonable. That silence was deliberate, chosen day after day. Cole knew he was being pushed farther to the sidelines, but he didn't react. He told himself it was only a phase, that if he did his assigned work well, everything would be fine. On the basis, people lived off thoughts like that for a very long time. Harlan continued watching, not intervening. He understood Cole hadn't chosen a side. He stood in the middle, the most dangerous place to be. One evening, as Harlan finished his shift and prepared to leave the field, he glanced back. Cole was still there, the light hitting his face at an angle, revealing a hesitation no longer hidden. Cole knew he was being pushed aside, but he told himself that staying silent just a little longer would be enough. That night began like many others on the base. The hallway lights in the technical wing switched on late, creating long strips of reflection across the cement floor. Cole walked down the hall with a stack of files under his arm, his steps even and light. He'd been assigned to recheck some equipment for the next day's training, a task of little importance, but enough to keep him after hours. Cole was used to these kinds of assignments, the jobs no one noticed, but for which he would be the first held responsible if anything went wrong. As he neared the small operations room at the end of the hall, Cole slowed. The door was slightly ajar, a thin line of light spilling out. Inside, a familiar voice spoke, Mason Hale's voice, not loud, not harsh, but low and cold, the kind used when discussing decisions already made. Cole came to a full stop, flattening himself against the wall. He hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but the words were clear enough that he couldn't pretend he hadn't heard them. Hale said Cole hadn't been as firm lately. The comment was delivered lightly, like an objective observation. Another voice responded lower, calmer, saying that if something went wrong, pushing the blame onto Cole would be the cleanest solution. The statement held neither anger nor threat. It was offered the way one might suggest a practical option in an internal meeting. Cole stood still behind the door, gripping his radio so tightly the joints in his fingers turned white. He kept his breathing steady, making no sound. In that moment, all the scattered pieces from the past months aligned at once. His removal from the position near the camera, the gradual reassignment of important duties to others, and Hale's evaluating glances whenever something minor went wrong. All of it pointed to this moment. Cole didn't feel shocked. What he felt most clearly was confirmation. The thing he had vaguely sensed was now spoken aloud with no attempt to soften it. The silence he'd chosen, the one he believed kept him safe, had become the reason he was easy to sacrifice. In this system, the quietest man was also the most replaceable. The conversation inside continued for a few more lines, but Cole no longer heard them clearly. He stepped back once, then again, until he was fully out of sight of the doorway. He turned and walked down the hall the other way. Each step was measured, silent. When he stepped outside, the cold night air filled his lungs and sharpened his thoughts. Cole headed straight to the parking lot behind the technical building. He opened his truck door, sat in the driver's seat, and shut the door. The small, enclosed space was quiet, completely separated from the base outside. Cole set the files on the passenger seat, placed his hands on the wheel, but didn't start the engine. He stared ahead for a long time before pulling out his phone. The screen lit up with a photo of his wife and child on a late afternoon weekend. The child smiled brightly. His wife stood beside him with her hand on the boy's shoulder. Cole looked at the picture for a long time. In his mind, other images overlapped the night field. Fallen recruits, the camera light switching off at the perfect moment. He realized that if something happened, the first name called would be his. Reports needed someone low enough, not to cause waves, familiar enough that the story could be wrapped up quickly. Cole put his phone away and leaned back. A part of him wanted to start the truck, drive out of the base immediately, find a reason to request reassignment, or take extended leave. But he knew none of those choices would solve anything. Everything had already been arranged, and he was standing in the center of that arrangement. In the days that followed, Cole continued working as usual. No shift in attitude, no sign of unease. He responded to orders promptly, completed reports fully, but inside, he began observing differently. He paid closer attention to the moments when the cameras shut off, to the system errors that appeared and fixed themselves. He didn't ask, didn't log anything officially. He simply remembered the way Harlan always did. During one shift, while reviewing system data, Cole found a corrupted recording, only a few seconds long blurred image, skewed angle, broken audio. It was taken during a night training session, at a time when the camera should have been recording everything. Cole stared at the file, his heartbeat slowing. He knew the system treated this sort of thing as trash, a technical glitch soon to be deleted in routine cleanup. Cole hesitated for a few seconds. His hand hovered over the keyboard, his eyes flicking to the door. No one was there. He plugged in a personal storage device, working fast and clean. The corrupted segment was copied. No alerts, no warnings. When the transfer finished, Cole erased traces of access and restored the system to its original state. Everything happened in complete silence. He removed the device and slipped it into his inner pocket. His pulse beat harder than before, but his mind was steady. Cole understood that what he had done could spin out of control if discovered, but he also understood that without this, he would have nothing when the time came. Cole left the operations room and passed the drill field. It was late. Only a few scattered lights remained. At the far edge, Harlan was cleaning, his movements slow and steady as always. Cole watched him from a distance. They didn't greet each other or signal anything, but in that brief moment, Cole recognized something he shared with the old janitor. Both of them were staying here for reasons neither could say aloud. On the way back to his quarters, Cole thought about the conversation he had overheard, the sound of Hale's voice, the other officer's tone, the way they spoke of him like a replaceable part. Anger didn't flare the way he'd imagined it might. Instead, a cold, clear feeling settled in. He had spent too long believing silence would keep him away from trouble. Now that same silence was putting him in the most dangerous place. That night, Cole lay awake for a long time. He listened to the wind outside the window, the sound of a patrol car driving off into the distance. In his mind, a single thought repeated itself, slow and steady. If something happened, he needed something that could save him. Lunch hour on the base was always when everything overlapped. Morning training had just ended, and groups of Marines moved toward the mess hall in waves, sweat still clinging to their collars, voices spilling out after hours of being pressed into discipline. Metal trays clattered together non-stop, chairs scraped against the floor, forming a familiar mix of sounds so constant that no one noticed the individual noises anymore. In that flow of movement, Harlan Vance pushed his mop cart slowly, the same way he had for 8 years. He was used to being unnoticed. People stepped around his cart by reflex, shifting aside before continuing their unfinished conversations. One private talked about the morning session, and another laughed loudly while recalling someone being punished with extra push-ups. Harlan heard everything, but his ears were no longer searching for pieces like before. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every step he took in the mess hall had a purpose, slow and steady. The officer's table sat in the center area, always kept cleaner than the rest. It was a place Harlan rarely lingered. He usually wiped it quickly, avoided eye contact, and then moved on. Today, he stopped. Harlan leaned the mop against the cart, reached out, and pulled out an empty chair at the officer's table. The sound of the chair touching the floor wasn't loud, but distinct enough for several heads to lift. A moment passed, then, a few more seconds. The noise in the mess hall softened slightly, as if someone had turned the volume down a notch. A few Marines turned to look. Some frowned. Some raised their eyebrows. A voice from a nearby table spoke, low but clear enough for others to hear. "What's he doing there?" Harlan sat down, back straight, hands placed on the table. He didn't look around and didn't rush. For 8 years, he had stood, bent, and slipped into every quiet corner this base allowed. Now, sitting at this spot felt different, like an act that broke an invisible order everyone had agreed to follow. He opened his chest-off drawers and took out the old silver Zippo. The scratched metal reflected the ceiling lights in faint streaks. Harlan set it on the table, right in front of him. The word "Rooster" was clear, the engraved lines deep, unadorned, but firm. He placed it down gently, yet the motion felt like a pebble dropped onto still water. A group of young Marines at the next table began to snicker. At first, just a few scattered laughs, testing the reaction. One said, half joking, "Guess the old guy's lost." Another joined in, their laughter louder, more relaxed when no one stopped them. Harlan sat still, eyes forward, as if the noise never touched him. Across the mess hall, Mason Hale was halfway through his lunch. The laughter reached him, different from the usual noise. Hale lifted his head, following the sound. When he saw Harlan sitting at the officer's table, hands on the surface with the silver Zippo before him, Hale's gaze paused a fraction longer, not out of surprise, but because someone had just crossed a boundary he assumed was permanent. Hale stood. His boots hit the floor clearly, each step deliberate. The mess hall's attention shifted toward the unfolding scene. A few people grew quiet, and forks stopped mid-air. Curiosity spread faster than the laughter. Harlan heard Hale approaching but didn't turn. Hale stopped at the table, leaned down, and looked at the Zippo. He picked it up, turning it lightly in his hand, examining the worn metal like it was an out-of-place object. He gave a thin smile, the kind of smile from someone confident of his rank. "Old man's got a call sign too." "Huh," Hale said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Several laughs burst out, clearer this time. No hesitation. Harlan lifted his head and looked directly at Hale. His eyes were calm, neither challenging nor retreating. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched just long enough to make a few people uneasy. Hale set the Zippo down, though not exactly where it had been. He pushed it toward Harlan, as if granting permission. "You're in the wrong seat," Hale continued, his voice lower, edged with warning. "This place isn't for the cleaning staff." Harlan didn't stand. He didn't explain or apologize. In that moment, he understood clearly that every exit behind him had closed. If he stood up now, everything would return to how it had been, and 8 years of waiting would be pushed back into an indefinite distance. He kept his posture, hands on the table, eyes locked on Hale. Silence rippled outward in a small wave. An officer at the next table shifted as if about to speak, then didn't. Others watched, each in their own way, some waiting to see how it would end, some hoping it would end quickly so lunch could continue. Hale looked around and saw how many eyes were on him. He smiled lightly, as if this were nothing more than midday entertainment. He reached for his tray. The smell of hot sauce drifted up. In a quick, sudden motion, Hale flung the entire tray toward Harlan. Hot sauce spilled across him, the table, the floor. The metal tray slammed onto the ground with a sharp clang. In an instant, the mess hall erupted in laughter. Loud, chaotic sounds drowned out every other reaction. Harlan sat still, soaked in hot food, but he didn't rise. The moment felt like a lock clicking into place, holding everything steady just before the point where nothing could be undone. Hot sauce dripped down the front of Harlan Vance's shirt, soaking into the faded fabric worn thin from years of washing. The heat rose faintly, enough for those nearby to smell the sharp, familiar spice. A few drops hit the floor, spreading beneath the officer's table. Harlan didn't move. He didn't bend down to wipe anything, didn't jump up the way the crowd expected. His back stayed straight, his shoulders low, the posture of someone more accustomed to enduring than reacting. Laughter erupted, loud at first and scattered, then growing into a wider wave. Some laughed because they enjoyed the sight, others because they didn't want to fall out of rhythm with the group. Mason Hale stood there with a grin still hanging on his lips, his eyes scanning the faces around him to confirm the control he was used to. For him, this was routine, a way to remind the crowd of their place. But Harlan didn't stand. He lifted his head slowly, as if passing through layers of air still trembling with laughter. His eyes locked onto Hale's. There was no burst of anger, no overt challenge. It was the look of a man who had prepared what he would say long ago, waiting only for the exact moment to set it down. Harlan spoke, his voice steady and low. No force needed, no volume required. "Rooster was my son's name." A short sentence, untouched by embellishment. It didn't sound like defiance, and it wasn't a plea. It simply existed, like a fact placed on the table. The laughter stuttered in places, not fully dying but losing its rhythm. A few men gave awkward chuckles, glancing to the sides, as if searching for a cue on whether to stop or continue. Hale raised an eyebrow. For a split second, he didn't understand why the atmosphere had shifted. He opened his mouth, ready to toss out a familiar joke, but Harlan didn't leave him the space. "That night, you kicked with your right foot." The tone remained the same, no faster, no slower, only the content changed. The second sentence dropped heavily than the first. The sound of utensils paused mid-air. A private, chewing his food, froze, eyes fixed on the officer's table. Hale leaned forward slightly. He smiled, but it was no longer a full smile. "What the hell are you rambling about?" he said, trying to keep the joking tone. Though the end of his sentence fractured, he waited for the crowd to laugh again, to pull him back to the position he recognized. Harlan went on, his eyes never leaving Hale. A diagonal angle, up from below. This time, the shift in the room was unmistakable. An officer at the next table set his tray down more slowly than usual. Another person turned his chair slightly, eyes flicking from Harlan to Hale, and lingering a beat longer. The details just spoken didn't sound invented. They were specific, precise, and delivered by someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. Hale tightened his jaw. He looked around the mess hall. The faces that moments ago showed amusement now carried traces of caution. No one openly sided with him, but no one stepped in to defend him either. The space between those two extremes widened, and Hale felt it. Harlan continued, his voice dropping just a little, as if the whole hall didn't need to hear. Camera 4 went dark at 2217. The sentence landed and stayed there. It needed no explanation. The number was specific enough that anyone familiar with how the base operated knew this wasn't some wild guess. A few officers exchanged quick, quiet looks. No one spoke, but the attention had shifted away from Hale, spreading outward into a new direction. The mess hall settled into a strange silence. Not total quiet, but the kind that comes when everyone realizes they've just heard something that shouldn't have been spoken aloud here. The whir of the ventilation became audible. A tray clanged briefly as someone bumped it. Hale stood with one hand on the table, fingers slightly curled. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. In his head, the usual lines cycled: threats, jokes, dismissals, but each one hit the same problem. The details were too exact to brush off with a grin. He glanced toward a familiar officer, searching for backup. The man avoided his gaze, pretending to adjust his chair. "What do you want?" Hale finally said, his voice lower, stripped of its usual humor. The question slipped into the tense air, but it didn't pull the control back to him. Harlan didn't answer. He had said what he needed to say. He looked at Hale for one more second, then lowered his gaze to the table. The sauce had cooled, clinging to his shirt. His hand rested near the silver Zippo, though he didn't touch it. Its presence alone echoed the first sentence, the name that had opened everything. People around them began to realize this moment was no longer a casual humiliation. No one stood to leave. No one laughed. Silence spread slowly from the officer's table outward, a chain reaction that needed no command. Hale stayed still. For the first time since entering the mess hall, he had no immediate response. Everything he usually used to dominate a room felt ineffective against details spoken at the right time, in the right order. His eyes flicked over Harlan, then settled on the space ahead of him, as if trying to rebuild a structure that had just been knocked askew. The hall stayed in that suspended state for several long seconds. No shouting. No, next move. Only the heavy silence of a place that had just watched authority get cornered without a way to deny it. And in that silence, for the first time, Mason Hale had nothing to say. "If you want to continue the story, stay with me. What happened in this mess hall isn't finished. It's only just beginning to spread." After that lunch, no one on the base brought up what had happened in the mess hall. There were no reports, no written statements, no official reminders. On the surface, everything seemed to return to its usual order. But Harlan Vance noticed the next day that the rhythm of the base had shifted very slightly. Hard to name, but clear enough for someone who had lived here 8 years to sense. In the morning, as he pushed his cleaning cart down the barracks hallway, his eyes began to linger longer. Not obvious stares, just quick glances that pulled away too fast. No one joked. No one tossed casual comments like before. A private speaking mid-sentence fell silent as Harlan passed. Another stepped aside earlier than necessary to give him room. Harlan kept his head down, working steadily as if unaware of the change, but every small gesture found its place in his mind. On the training field, Mason Hale started shouting harder. His voice rose sharper. His orders came in rapid bursts with no room for pause. When a recruit fell behind, Hale called him out instantly, forcing push-ups in the middle of the field. The others lowered their heads, focusing tightly on their own steps. Harlan stood at the edge, broom in hand, watching with cold familiarity. He recognized this pattern. It was the reaction of someone who felt their control slipping, trying to tighten the grip to prove nothing had changed. One afternoon, Harlan walked past the office corridor and saw Hale speaking with a junior officer. Hale spoke fast, eyes sharp, pointing to a stack of files on the desk. The officer nodded, but when Hale turned away, he avoided meeting Hale's eyes and stepped aside, as if wanting to escape the conversation immediately. The moment was brief, but enough for Harlan to understand that silence was reaching into layers. Hale once commanded easily. Cole sensed the shift differently. After that lunch, Hale began watching him more closely. Longer stares, questions disguised as casual about his duty schedule, about how long he'd been near the camera area. Cole answered every question, calm and steady, revealing nothing, but he knew he had moved into Hale's sights. The silence that once kept him safe now made Hale suspicious. During an evening shift, Cole was recording training times when Hale appeared behind him. Hale didn't speak at first, just stood there long enough for Cole to sense his presence from the shadow falling across the ground. "You've been thorough lately," Hale said, voice even but without praise. Cole replied that he was following procedure. Hale nodded, but his eyes stayed on Cole as he walked away. Cole understood that from now on, every move he made would be weighed. Harlan continued his work as usual. He cleaned the mess hall, swept the training grounds, and tended the hallways. But there was one noticeable difference. No one mocked him anymore. The young Marines who had laughed when he sat at the officer's table now avoided his eyes. Someone even nodded to him in an awkward greeting. Harlan didn't respond, nor did he pull away. He understood this change wasn't respect, it was unease. One evening, while Harlan was cleaning near the supply shed, he overheard two privates whispering. Their voices were low, but clear enough. One said, "The old man said the camera time exactly." The other was quiet for a few seconds before replying, "Yeah, I heard some of the guys upstairs talking about it too." They went silent when they noticed Harlan approaching. The conversation ended there, but Harlan knew whispers like that wouldn't stop. Hale heard them too, though no one spoke to him directly. He felt it in how people reacted when he entered a room. Fewer laughs, fewer easy agreements, more eyes are avoiding his. He started rechecking reports, examining small details as if searching for a leak he could seal. He called his sergeants in one by one, asking what they'd heard, who had said what, who had been near whom. One late night, Hale summoned Cole into his office. The door shut behind them, sealing off the noise outside. Hale sat down, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Cole. "What did you say to him?" Hale asked, with no preamble. The question fell straight onto the desk, blunt and direct. Cole stood still, hands in front of him, posture exact. He answered after a short beat. There was nothing to say. His voice was level, neither defensive nor challenging. Hale stared at him for a long time. He searched for a flicker of doubt, a glance away, any hesitation, but Cole's expression didn't shift. The moment stretched until the ceiling fan's hum became distinct. Finally, Hale nodded and motioned for him to leave. No threats were spoken, but Cole understood the suspicion had settled onto him. The following days passed in a low, constant tension. Hale pushed discipline harder, as if pressure alone could smother rumors. Cole kept working, more careful now, speaking less. Harlan kept observing, recording silently, never deviating from his routine. All three men understood that what happened in the mess hall couldn't be erased by surface quiet. Silence now meant something different. It was no longer a shield, it was the sign that something was waiting to break open. In narrow hallways, in night training sessions, in closed offices, tension thickened piece by piece. A few days later, during what should have been a routine training session, a serious accident occurred. The accident happened during an afternoon training session. With the field still crowded, there had been no warning, no obvious irregularity in the schedule. A recruit collapsed after the final sprint and didn't get back up. The call for medical support came one beat later than usual. By the time the stretcher reached the field, many eyes had already turned away. On this basis, everyone understood that looking too closely at certain moments only made trouble last longer. Mason Hale stood nearby, hands on his hips, face unreadable. He signaled for the session to end earlier than planned, his voice firm, as if this were just an unwanted incident that needed quick handling. The injured recruit was taken away. The field gradually emptied, but the heavy air remained. Cole stood at the edge, clipboard in hand, staring at some point far beyond the ground. He knew this moment would come. It arrived exactly the way he'd heard it discussed in the technical wing that night. The accident report was drafted that same evening. There was no long meeting, no debate. A sergeant brought a folder to Cole's office, set it on his desk, and said it needed his signature. Cole turned to the first page. His name sat at the top line, clear and unmistakable, placed as the one directly responsible. The signature slots for the rest of the team were left blank, but his own position was marked. Cole looked up and asked who had decided this. The man delivering the file answered that it was an order from above, tone flat, without personal feeling. Cole signed. His handwriting was straight, steady. In that moment, he understood that everything had been arranged beforehand. Whether he signed or refused only affected the speed of the process, not the outcome. When he slid the folder back, the man nodded, took it, and left immediately, as if staying longer might force him to say more than he wanted to. The next morning, Cole was informed he was temporarily removed from his supervisory role. The younger sergeant, the one who joked with Hale during drills, was promoted to replace him. The decision was delivered cleanly, without details. To most people, it looked like a reasonable adjustment after an incident. Cole stood beside the group, listened, and nodded like always. He didn't react or ask questions, but he noticed Hale's glance grazing across him, cold and quick, as if confirming things were moving in the right direction. That night, military police came for Cole. There was no noisy escort. Two uniformed men knocked on his door and told him he needed to cooperate with an investigation. Cole put on his jacket and followed them down the dark hallway. The fluorescent lights above cast broken patches of brightness onto the floor. When the holding room door shut behind him, Cole sat down on the metal chair and exhaled. He wasn't surprised. It felt like the arrival of something long predicted. Time moved slowly in the small holding room. Cole leaned against the wall, staring at the ceiling. Old images returned clearly. A recruit's voice begging to stop during a night drill years ago. Hoarse and urgent, the way that recruit had looked at him, waiting for a different order, some kind of intervention. Cole remembered turning toward Hale instead of toward the recruit. The decision lasted less than a second, but its echo had followed him for years. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, fingers touching the familiar plastic surface of the device he'd hidden. The data was still there, those few blurred seconds of footage, the broken audio the system had discarded. Cole closed his eyes for a moment. He understood that what he held could change everything, or destroy everything he had left. His record, his career, his family life, all of it balanced on that choice. In the following days, Cole was questioned repeatedly. The questions circled around procedure, responsibility, timing. He answered exactly what was in the official report, nothing more. The investigators kept a neutral tone, neither accusing nor offering opportunities to explain. In this system, truth did not live in words, it lived in whatever was already written on paper. Cole gradually understood that his silence was performing exactly the role others needed. It let everything pass smoothly, let the incident wrap itself neatly around one name, let those above avoid uncomfortable questions. He was the perfect fall guy, low enough to sacrifice, familiar enough to close the case quietly. One evening, sitting alone in the holding room, Cole thought of Harlan Vance, the image of the old janitor sitting still in the mess hall. Voice, even as he spoke the name, Rooster, came back to him. Cole saw the difference between them. Harlan had stayed silent for 8 years, but his silence had purpose and preparation. Cole's silence had begun as a way to avoid responsibility. Cole stood and paced a few short steps in the cramped room. He stopped, took a deep breath. If he stayed silent, everything would end here. He would take the blame, then be reassigned or quietly discharged. His life could continue in another shape, with a cleaner record, but everything he had seen and heard would remain, wearing him down day after day. He returned to the chair and sat. His hand went back to the device in his pocket, resting there longer this time. A decision formed, not sudden, not dramatic, but slow and solid. He knew that if he wanted to break this cycle, he couldn't do it alone. He needed someone who understood the system deeply, who had waited long enough, and who had the resolve to step forward when the moment arrived. Cole called for the guard, voice steady. When the guard came, Cole spoke clearly. He wanted to see Harlan Vance. It was the first time Cole had broken the silence he had relied on for years. The base auditorium had been prepared early. The ceiling lights glowed evenly, reflecting off rows of neatly arranged chairs. At the front was a small stage with a podium and a flag set slightly to one side. All the familiar details of a formal ceremony were present, from the unit's nameplate to the decorative ribbon hung neatly behind the stage. The families of the soldiers filled the front rows, many dressed formally, hands resting properly on their laps. The air carried the familiar sense of formality, the kind that pushes personal stories into the background. Harlan Vance sat in the last row, his figure blending into the crowd. He wasn't in uniform, and he wore no insignia. He sat still, both hands resting on his knees, eyes on the stage. To him, this room was like many others on the base, the only difference being the extra lights and unfamiliar faces. He wasn't looking for anyone, nor waiting for a particular signal. His being here was enough. When the opening music played, everyone stood on reflex. A senior officer stepped up to give a brief introduction about the unit's training achievements. The numbers were read clearly, emphasizing completion rates and progress beyond targets. Mason Hale's name was mentioned as a highlight, a model of discipline and effectiveness. Applause broke out, even and well-timed. Hale walked onto the stage with his usual smile. His uniform was crisp, every fold sharp. His steps were confident, comfortable under the weight of attention. He nodded toward the families in the front rows, his eyes glancing across senior officers, stopping for a fraction of a second before moving on. In that moment, Hale looked exactly like the figure the system wanted to present, a model leader, confident and recognized. Harlan watched him from afar, his expression unchanged. He no longer saw the intimidation he once did. What he saw was a man standing in the right spot at the right moment, on a stage built for him. What happened next didn't depend on how well Hale stood or smiled. As the ceremony moved into the review segment, the lights dimmed. The large screen behind the stage lit up. At first, familiar images appeared: recruits, training, orderly formations, carefully curated moments. The narration was steady, report-like. Everything followed the script. Then the footage changed. The next video was less clear. The angle was skewed, the lighting unstable, the sound carried static. A few people in the auditorium leaned forward, trying to see better. The video showed a group of recruits training at night. The image was blurry but recognizable. Heavy breathing filled the audio, followed by a thin, weak voice asking to stop. The entire auditorium froze. No one moved. The usual whispers that drift through such ceremonies disappeared. The plea to stop sounded again thin, brief, as if squeezed between other noises. Harlan sat straighter, his eyes fixed on the screen. Then another voice cut in cold and firm. Continue. That voice was unmistakable. Several people turned toward Hale on reflex. Others looked back at the screen, then down at the stage, trying to join the two images together. The atmosphere stretched tight, like someone had pulled an invisible thread across the room. Hale stood still on stage. The smile on his face slowly faded. He tilted his head, looked up at the screen, then back at the audience. "This video has been edited," he said, voice strained but controlled. "Someone took incomplete data and tried to create a misunderstanding." No applause followed, no supportive murmurs. The families in the front rows remained still, their eyes no longer fixed on Hale. A senior officer leaned toward a colleague and whispered something quickly. Another crossed his arms, gaze locked on Hale for longer than necessary. From the back of the hall, a figure stepped out. Cole appeared, not in uniform, his face tense but resolved. He walked slowly, step by step, toward the stage. Every gaze turned to him. Some recognized him, others simply sensed this was not part of the program. Cole stopped in the aisle. He didn't speak at first. He looked at the screen, then at Hale. In that moment, Harlan saw the change in him clearly. Gone was the hesitant stance of someone waiting for orders. What stood there was a man who had accepted the consequences. The video played for a few more seconds, then froze. The auditorium was silent. No one shifted. Not even the polite coughs people used to break the tension appeared. Everything seemed held in a pause. Hale cleared his throat, trying to speak again, but no words came. He looked around, searching for a familiar nod, some silent signal that he still held control. The faces that once nodded now avoided his eyes. A few people lowered their gaze to the ceremony program, pretending to find something there. From the last row, Harlan watched it all. He didn't see chaos. He didn't see an explosion of reaction. What he saw was a collective slowing, as if the entire system were forced to stop and reassess itself. What he had waited 8 years for did not arrive through shouting or sudden confrontation, but through the silence of those who once shielded Hale. A senior officer stood and moved toward the wing, speaking briefly with someone out of sight. The stage lights remained steady, but the atmosphere had shifted. Hale stood alone at center stage, more alone than he had ever been, even with the room full around him. From both sides of the stage, military police stepped out. Their pace was slow, even, unhurried. Their appearance was clear enough for everyone to understand that the ceremony had taken a different turn. Cole stood still in the aisle, eyes fixed on the stage. Harlan exhaled a long breath he had been holding since the video began. The military police moved closer, their steps narrowing the distance between them and Mason Hale. The auditorium remained silent. No one rose. No one spoke. The ceremony of honor stalled at that moment. Every eye locked on the stage, waiting for what would happen next. Mason Hale stood at the center of the stage, the lights shining directly on his face. Moments earlier, he had still been in his familiar position, the place where every gaze once turned toward him, with fear and obedience. Now, those gazes had shifted. Hale turned toward the officers' rows, searching for a familiar face, a subtle nod, any sign that this could still be handled the old way. Nothing met his eyes. One officer turned away. Another lowered his gaze to the ceremony program as if it still mattered. The distancing happened quietly, but it was decisive. The military police stepped onto the stage. Their movements were slow and precise, carrying no hostility, no show of force. One stood on Hale's left, the other on his right, leaving just enough space for him to understand what was coming. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never formed. In the auditorium's silence, the click of metal cuffs echoed clearly as they locked around his wrists. The action took place before hundreds of eyes. No one reacted. No one spoke. The honor Hale had carried for years collapsed in a cold, simple way. Cole stood in the aisle. He didn't look away when the cuffs closed on Hale. He didn't lower his head. His gaze stayed steady on the stage, as if he needed to witness this moment all the way through to believe it was real. His face held no satisfaction, no obvious relief. What appeared instead was an odd emptiness, the feeling of someone stepping out of a cycle that had gone on far too long. Meanwhile, Harlan Vance rose from the back row. He didn't hurry. His steps were slow, and even as he walked up the aisle, people moved aside without thinking. No one stopped him. No one looks that followed him carried a mix of things: curiosity, caution, a land-coming respect. Harlan looked at none of them. He walked straight toward the stage, where Hale stood held between the two MPs. When Harlan stepped onto the low rise of the stage, Hale lifted his head. Their eyes met for a brief moment. The usual contempt was gone. The familiar arrogance, gone with it. What showed instead was the confusion he hadn't had time to hide. Harlan stopped in front of him, close enough for the two men to see each other clearly. Neither spoke. The silence wasn't forced. It was simply what remained after everything that had already happened. Harlan reached into the chest pocket of his shirt. The movement was slow and deliberate, clear enough for those nearby to notice. He pulled out the old silver Zippo, its scratched metal reflecting the stage lights in dull streaks. He placed it on the small table beside the podium, right in front of Hale. The word "Rooster" etched on the lid was plain to see, needing no explanation. Hale looked down at the Zippo. In that moment, everything he had mocked in the dining hall rose up sharply. But this time, there was no laughter behind him, no crowd at his back. Only an older man standing steady, calm-eyed, holding out an object, weighted with meaning. Hale could no longer deny. Harlan flipped the lighter open. The click was sharp and dry, cutting through the auditorium's silence. A small flame rose, flickering slightly in the air conditioning. Harlan watched it for a second, then snapped the lid shut. The metallic closure echoed again, final and firm. He said nothing throughout the gesture. No one spoke, not a whisper, not a cough to break the suspended quiet. Everyone there understood that any words now would be unnecessary. The truth stood plainly in front of them, bare and undeniable, needing no further defense. The MPs signaled and began to move Hale away. He turned once, his gaze sweeping across the wide auditorium that had once given him long rounds of applause. Now, everything was silent. Harlan stepped back, giving them room. He watched Hale until he disappeared behind the side door. Only then did he turn away and step down from the stage the way he came. Cole watched Harlan as he passed. They didn't exchange long looks, but both understood that from this moment on, each would follow his own path. Cole would face investigations and the consequences that had always been inevitable. Harlan's path was different. He had finished what he had stayed here to do. The auditorium emptied in an oddly orderly way. No loud conversations, no speculation spoken out loud. People left with their own thoughts, carrying the scene they had just witnessed like a question without a clean answer. Chairs emptied, lights dimmed. The ceremony ended without any formal closing. That night, Harlan left the base. He drove out as the side gate opened slowly. The yellow lights behind him faded in the rearview mirror. The road ahead was quiet, the engine steady. Harlan didn't turn on the radio. He let the silence fill the car. He stopped at the small cemetery on a low hill, where his son was buried. Night had fallen, and the wind moved softly through the rows of stone markers. Harlan stepped out, the Zippo in his hand. He walked slowly between the graves until he reached the familiar one. His son's name was carved cleanly, the birth and death dates closer together than they should have been. Harlan stood there for a long time. He didn't speak. He flipped the lighter open. The small flame rose in the dark, bright and fragile. He watched it, let the wind bend it, then watched it steady itself again. After a few seconds, he closed the lid. The flame disappeared. In the quiet of the cemetery, everything finally went still. The story of Harlan Vance isn't just a journey to reclaim justice for a lost son. It's a cold slice of how a system can run smoothly enough to hide its own failures, and how silence, if prolonged long enough, can become a form of complicity. Harlan didn't win through force, authority, or emotional outburst. He won through patience, through memory, and through understanding the system better than the people hiding behind it. The story reveals a difficult truth. Evil doesn't always appear in extreme acts, but often hides within convenient decisions, proper reports, and in those who turn away to protect their own place. From one father's personal story, the lesson extends to all of us. When facing wrongdoing, silence may keep us safe in the short term, but it also sustains injustice in the long term. A system only changes when someone is brave enough to break that silence, even when the cost is high. This story also reminds us that justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes quietly, when the truth is placed in the right moment, the right place, and can no longer be denied. Every small action, every personal choice, can become the starting point for something larger. If you were in Cole's place, or Harlan's, or among the bystanders, would you stay silent, or speak up? And more importantly, would that choice come from fear, or from responsibility? If this story made you reflect, share it, so more people can learn from it. Thank you for staying until the end. We are committed to bringing you the finest content stories that reach deep into human emotion and value. Don't forget to subscribe to follow more inspiring stories.